Morning, oyster catchers, and this is the last day before we go back to school, or come back to school next Monday on the 8th, so we're all really looking forward to that. It'd be lovely to meet up again and get back to some kind of normality, so that's really good. I had a lovely week this week. I know I've seen the pieces of work that you've been sending in, that's wonderful. Just to say, for year fives, we're changing our Zoom time tomorrow, so it's going, or today, sorry. This afternoon it's going to be 2 o'clock instead of 3:30. So I've sent a link to your Office 365, so look forward to seeing you then for the last time, obviously, before we come back on Monday, so that'd be great. Okay, looking at chapter 22, Tom's Midnight Garden, getting towards the end of it, and we're going to watch the film as well on Monday, so that's something else exciting to look forward to. And this one's called The Forgotten Promise. So when Tom woke on Thursday morning, his first thought was that he had missed his precious chance of going back to the garden last night. His second thought was for the hiding place under the floorboards. Almost he thought that he must have dreamt of the discovery. But when he opened the cupboard door, there was a raised floorboard with his penknife beside it. He saw the 2 brown paper packages in the hole, drew them out and unwrapped them. They were a pair of skates with boots still screwed and strapped to them. Then he saw a slip of paper left behind in the floor cavity. Now the floor cavity is a space underneath the floorboards. He brought it out and read what was written on it. To whomever may find this, these skates are the property of Harriet Melbourne, but she leaves them in this place in fulfilment of a promise she once made to a little boy. So the word fulfilment, what does that mean? Well, it means the achievement of something desired. In other words, carrying out the promise. Okay? The note was signed and dated June the 20th. The year was there too, but so smudged by the death of some insect that Tom could only read the first 2 numbers, a 1 and an 8. Tom spent a good deal of that day gloating over Hattie's skates. His skates. They are of an older fashion than Tom knew, and belonged to an older fashion of skating too. They were fen runners, whose blades end in a long curved prow to cut through the rougher surfaces of outdoor ice. So the prow is the front of them. And that's as a skater travels mile after mile over the great frozen distances that the fens afford. He tended the skates as best he could. He said nothing to his uncle or aunts, but he looked for emery paper. Now emery paper is an old-fashioned name for sandpaper as we know it today. And at last found some in his uncle's toolbox and rubbed the rust off the skate blades. The blades ought to have been reground perhaps, but that was more than Tom could manage. So when you regrind something, you use a grindstone like a bench grinder. I've got one here, I'll just show you briefly. So that's a bench grinder. You can just see it there, look, can you see? And that sort of spins round very fast, and it's got some very, very hard and rough pieces on here. Not quite sure what that's made of, but it's, obviously when you put metal against there, it then grinds it so it's very, very sharp. So that's my bench grinder. Would have been very old-fashioned back in the day though, of course. Much more old-fashioned. Wouldn't have been an electric one like mine. Okay. So, he borrowed a bottle of olive oil from his aunt's larder and oiled the wooden footstock and the parched leather of the straps and boots. The leather was parched. And parched means dry. Over the years it had become very, very dry, so it needs to be re-oiled, and that's why he went to go and fetch the olive oil to see if he could make it a little bit more supple. That's a good word to use. He tried on the boots. They were almost a perfect fit, perhaps a little on the large size, but that was all too good. All to the good. He could wear 2 pairs of socks inside them. Why would he want to wear 2 pairs of socks inside them? to keep his feet warm. Tells us that the weather was pretty cold outside. While Tom was oiling the boots, the thing he had so long been seeking for came to him. The solution, rounded and perfect, of his problem of time. His aunt was out shopping, so that Tom was working with the olive oil quite openly on the kitchen table. The kitchen clock was facing him, staring at him intently. Good word to use, intently. It's one we've had before. Intently means, what does intently mean? It means really with eager attention. So he gazed at her intently, for example. And suddenly Tom thought of that night, many nights ago now, when he'd returned its gaze, at first with disbelief. Another good word, disbelief. Look at the word dis there, which is the prefix or prefix, and that's an antonym, or the anti, the opposite of belief. So disbelief, the opposite of belief, didn't believe. And then, with an immense wonder, again another brilliant word, immense means really big, strong. The clock had told him then that whereas he took several minutes to get downstairs to the garden door and then up again, he took no time at all to wander all round the garden. However long a time he spent in the garden, the kitchen clock measured none of it. He spent time there without spending a fraction of a second of ordinary time. That was perhaps what the grandfather clock had meant by striking a 13th hour. The hours after the 12th do not exist in ordinary time. They're not bound by the laws of ordinary time. They are not over in 60 ordinary minutes. They're endless. Tom rubbed the oil along the straps, and his reasoning seemed smooth and right. He could spend an endless time in the garden if he liked. He could, after all, have both things, the garden and his family, because he could stay forever in the garden, and yet forever his family would be expecting him next Saturday afternoon. Time here would stand still at Thursday and wait for him. It would only start again if he left the garden and came back to the flat. I could stay in the garden forever, Tom told the kitchen clock, and laughed for joy, and then shivered a little because forever sounded long and lonely. But anyway, he reasoned, tonight I could try it out. I could stay just a few days, or a few weeks, or a year perhaps. But if I get tired of it, he really meant if he grew homesick, well, then I can always come back. And then there is another chance, on Friday night. I could stay longer then, only come back after I've seen everything in the garden and done everything. Tom thought of all the delights of the garden while he tended his skates. By the time the work was done, he was settled in his mind and happy. He was ready for the night. Only one thing went badly amiss that Thursday. Just as he was getting into bed, he remembered, I never wrote to Peter yesterday. Never mind, said his aunt, tucking him up. But I promised to. It's bad to break a promise, but I'm sure you didn't mean to. Luckily, it won't matter very much to Peter. Why, he'll be seeing you the day after tomorrow. Tom knew that it did matter. The broken promise was bad enough, but he knew as well that Peter would be feeling desperate without his letter. Peter needed all that Tom could write to him, to feed his imaginings, to feed his dreams. Write to me more about the garden and Hattie, he begged Tom. Tell me what you did. Be sure to tell me what you're going to do. Sorry, Pete, Tom murmured into his pillow and felt wretched. Good word again, wretched. What does wretched mean? Pretty poor and felt sorry for himself in a bad way. He hoped that Peter had by now got over the bitterness of his betrayal. Peter went to bed earlier than Tom, so that probably he'd already ended his day of disappointment with sleep. In this Tom was wrong. Peter was still awake, grieving. He had had no letter from Tom today, and he did not know why. Tom did not lightly forget promises. He did not know what Tom had been doing last night and the night before. He did not know what secrets Tom might now be master of. He did not know what wonderful things Tom might be doing this very night. Peter stared and stared across the half-darkness of his bedroom until his eyes blurred with tears and then cleared again. He longed more than ever he had done before to be with Tom, to know what he was doing. He fell asleep at last, with that longing in his mind. And the last view that his eyes closed upon was Tom's postcard view of Ely on the bedroom mantelpiece opposite. Quite an old-fashioned word, mantelpiece, and that's a sort of shelf that you'll find above fireplaces. It's called a mantelpiece. It's above the mantel. Tom fell asleep too, but woke promptly when the time came. He put on his 2 pairs of socks. This time he left both of his bedroom slippers to wedge open the door, the front door of the flat, carrying the skates. He went downstairs. Of course, it was quite impossible that the season outside was no longer winter after all, and yet he felt sure it was. When he opened the door, he found that he was right. A deep frost lay everywhere, binding fast the trees and all the plants of the garden, so that there seemed not the slightest movement or life. The garden might have been sculptured in a stone, such a frost there was. In the deep silence, Tom heard his name whispered hesitantly from behind him. He turned. Hattie was standing in the hall, dressed in thick, warm clothes, with a fur cap on her head and with a fur muff in which her hands were concealed. Okay, my first question for this chapter is going to be, what was the weather like? And how do you know? Okay, what was the weather like and how do you know? I wasn't sure if it were you, Tom, or a trick of the frostlight. Of course it's me, said Tom, and really wondered whether Hattie's eyesight were failing. I was hoping you might turn up, you and no one else. Look. Hattie withdrew one hand from her muff, and Tom saw that tucked inside it was her pair of skates. In reply, he held up his own. Hattie nodded in satisfaction, but she did not seem struck by any similarity of appearance. She did not know what Tom knew. James will be down in a minute, said Hattie. It's his turn to go to market in Castleford, and I'm going with him. He doesn't know that I mean to skate this afternoon, and where to. I mean skate right down to Ely. Can you? Asked Tom, awed. Hattie misunderstood him. Well, of course I shouldn't. It really isn't quite ladylike, so I mustn't tell anyone of it. And yet it would be even more improper to go alone. But I mean, is the river really frozen over? Frozen so hard, Tom. Why, Abel's grandfather says it's one of the hardest, longest frosts he's ever known. The river's frozen above here to below Castleford and below Ely. The river here is too near the source for the ice to be safe. But below Castleford and all through the fens... Oh, Tom, do come with me. Tom was excited and yet aghast. Now, without going to the garden at all, without even going through it. The garden will always be there, Hattie coaxed him. But this great frost... She stopped speaking suddenly and turned to face the stairs. Second question I'm going to ask is, what do you think the word coaxed might mean? What does coaxed mean? And advanced to stand beside Hattie. He would leave the garden for the time being and go with her. The newcomer, James, and he, too, was dressed for going out. He greeted Hattie and took his market bag and 2 thick travelling rugs off one of the hall brackets. Then all 3 of them went out by the front door of the Melbourne's house, through which Tom had never gone before. Outside in the drive, a pony and trap were waiting, with Abel at the pony's head. Abel's expression at the sight of Tom clearly said, "Never thought to see you again." All the old horror had vanished from his look. The third question today is going to be, How do we know that this particular part of the story is a different period in history? How do we know it's a different period in history? Okay, look carefully for the clues. They climbed into the trap and the rugs were wrapped round James and Hattie. Abel took the opportunity to give Tom a private, friendly wink. Then James flopped the reins along the pony's back and they started off. Down the Melbourne's drive, up a lane, with an orchard on one side and a meadow on the other. Turn right at a whitewashed cottage and then 5 miles or more of a brisk, ringing trot on icebound roads between icebound fields and meadows. To the east of them lay the low hills that looked like sleeping giants in the flat countryside. To the west of them, unseen, wound the river, taking the same direction as the high road towards Castleford. The next question's going to be, how do we know that they were going pretty quickly? Okay, which word tells us that they were going pretty quickly? Tom had been this way before with his uncle and aunt, but the view then had always been shut out by houses, and he'd always gone by bus or car. Indeed, never in all his life had he travelled behind a horse. Now he watched in fascination the muscular movement of the pony's foreshortened back and its hind quarters, almost under his feet. He felt the harsh springiness on the untired wheels as they bowled along. They reached Castleford in a market day throng. James put up the pony and trap at the University Arms, an odd name for an inn since Castleford had no university. Many of the farmers, millers and other businessmen from the country parts seemed to be doing the same. Then James, market bag in hand, prepared to go his way. Do you want to lift back later, Hattie? And the next question's going to be, why did the pub or the inn have an unusual name? What was unusual about the name? Or a bit odd? Thank you, Cousin James, she said, but I don't quite know when I should be ready to return. There's always a train, he said, so they parted. In the streets of Castleford, many people were carrying skates. Some were making for the river where it passes beneath the bridges of Castleford, between the sloping lawns of grass. The ice here was already good, but the distances to be skated could not be great. Hattie was after something better. She took some of the narrower back streets, darted with Tom after her, down a certain gas lane, and so brought him at last to the river, where it begins to leave Castleford, broadening and deepening as it goes. Here it prepares to enter the fenland, where many other waterways, loads and cuts and drains, with man-made directness, rivers with ancient meanderings, will, in their own time, join it. The stream that flowed narrowly across the meadow from Hattie's garden becomes already, before Ely, the great Ouse. Below Ely, the greatness of the Ouse swallows up the whole rivers, like the Lark and the Wissey. And so it goes on to be swallowed up itself in the greatness of the sea. All these and other fenland waters at the time of Tom's visit were in the grip of a memorable frost. Okay, 3 questions now to follow. And the first question in this little batch is, which is the largest river of those mentioned or named? How do we know? Okay, so which is the largest and how do we know? And finally, what I'd like you to do is, can you find this river that's mentioned on a map and then tell me its source and its mouth? So the source of the river and the mouth of the river. Enjoy the last day. Good luck. See you later. Bye-bye.